They said the Rhine was untouchable. The Germans called it their sacred river, the last great barrier standing between the Allies and the heart of the Third Reich. For years, it had been their shield, their pride, the line no enemy would ever cross. And as American troops fought their way through a shattered Europe, every soldier knew the truth whispered in the trenches: no one crosses the Rhine and lives. But in March of 1945, on the gray horizon near a town called Remagen, that belief would die, not by accident, not by plan, but by the courage of a few men who refused to wait for permission to make history. The 9th Armored Division had been pushing east for days, exhausted, dirty, and low on supplies. Rumors said the Germans were retreating across the Rhine, blowing up every bridge behind them. The plan was simple. The Allies would regroup, bomb the last crossings, and plan an organized invasion weeks later. But war doesn't wait for plans. Lieutenant Karl Timmerman, a 24-year-old from Nebraska, stood on a ridge overlooking the town of Remagen when he saw something that made his heart stop. The Ludendorff Bridge. Still standing. Still intact. A steel giant stretching across the cold gray water. For a moment, no one spoke. The Rhine was supposed to be sealed, every bridge destroyed. Yet there it was, like a doorway left open by mistake. And somewhere beyond it, the German army was running for its life. Timmerman radioed the sighting up the chain of command. His words came through static and disbelief. "Bridge at Remagen still stands." Headquarters thought it was a mistake. It wasn't, and what came next would change the course of the war. As artillery thundered in the distance, Timmerman's men crept closer, moving through the ruins of the town. German engineers were already wiring the bridge with explosives, ready to destroy it at any moment. The Americans had no orders to attack, no air cover, and no idea how many enemy troops were defending it. But they knew one thing: if that bridge went down, so would their chance to end the war months sooner. The choice was clear: wait and watch it blow, or move. The air was cold, the sky low with smoke. Tanks rolled forward, treads grinding over cobblestone streets. Infantry followed behind, young faces, eyes hard with exhaustion. One of them muttered, "We're walking into a death trap." Another just tightened his grip on the rifle and kept moving. As they reached the riverbank, the bridge loomed above them, massive steel girders twisted with black smoke, cables dangling, and enemy machine guns spitting fire from the towers. Every instinct screamed to take cover. But Timmerman didn't hesitate. "We're taking that bridge," he said quietly. And with that, the Americans began their charge. Mortar shells tore through the air, sending up clouds of debris. German snipers fired from windows, bullets cracking against metal beams. Still, the Americans pressed forward. Sappers ran ahead, searching for explosives under the bridge deck, cutting wires with trembling hands. The bridge was shaking under its own weight, every explosion threatening to send it crashing into the Rhine below. Halfway across, a massive blast went off. Smoke swallowed everything. Men hit the ground, ears ringing. When the dust cleared, the bridge was still standing, damaged, scarred, but alive. Then came the moment no one forgot. Sergeant Alex Drabick, an Ohio farm boy with nothing but raw nerve, sprinted across the open bridge under heavy fire. He was the first American to set foot on the far side of the Rhine. Behind him came dozens more, shouting, firing, crawling their way through hell. When they reached the far bank, the impossible had happened. American soldiers were across the Rhine. The bridge the Germans swore would never be taken was now in U.S. hands. Back in Berlin, the news hit Hitler like a knife. He screamed at his generals, accusing them of betrayal. How could the Americans have taken the Ludendorff Bridge? It was supposed to be destroyed. Within hours, the Germans launched desperate counterattacks. Jet fighters, artillery, even frogmen with underwater mines, all thrown at one single bridge. But it held. American engineers worked day and night to reinforce the structure, patching holes, replacing beams, fighting off attacks from the air. One officer said later, "We built under fire ate under fire, and slept under fire. But we never left that bridge. For 10 days it stood, a lifeline for American armor streaming into Germany. Thousands of troops, tanks, and supplies poured across the Rhine, turning what was supposed to be a fortress line into a doorway to victory. Each crossing brought the Allies closer to Berlin, closer to the end of a nightmare that had consumed the world. The men at Remagen had done more than capture a bridge. They had broken the spirit of an empire. But triumph came with a price. The Ludendorff Bridge, battered and twisted by days of bombardment, finally gave way. On March 17th, it collapsed into the Rhine with a thunderous roar, killing dozens of engineers who were still working on it. For the survivors, the sound was both tragic and triumphant. The bridge had done its job. The river that was supposed to divide Europe had become the path to peace. When word reached General Eisenhower, he couldn't believe it. He said, "The bridge at Remagen has done more for us than any other single event this year." For the men who crossed it, no medals could capture what they had lived through. Many were farm boys, mechanics, clerks, men who had never imagined being part of history. But in those few days, they had done what entire armies thought impossible. In the decades that followed, veterans would return to Remagen. The town rebuilt itself. The river grew quiet again, and the twisted remains of the bridge towers stood like ghosts watching over the water. One old soldier stood there once and said softly, "We didn't just cross a river. We crossed into the end of the war." The Germans had called the Rhine untouchable, their pride, their final defense. But on that cold March morning, American grit, courage, and faith tore that myth apart. The bridge that wasn't supposed to fall became the bridge that couldn't be stopped. And as the sun rose over the river that day, it carried more than light. It carried the sound of victory.
The news of Remagen spread through Allied lines faster than any radio signal. Men in muddy foxholes whispered it to one another in disbelief. They crossed the Rhine. To the weary soldiers who had fought across France and the Ardennes, those words sounded almost unreal. For months, they'd been told the Rhine was the endgame, the river that would have to be stormed at a terrible cost. And now, a single bridge had given them the key. American officers studying their maps saw the impossible become geometry, an open road into Germany's heart. In the command posts, the tone shifted from cautious planning to astonished opportunity. General Courtney Hodges of the First Army stared at the message, then looked up and said, "Hold that bridge, whatever it takes." Eisenhower's staff immediately moved to exploit it. Divisions were rerouted overnight. Engineers, medics, and convoys raced toward Remagen. The Rhine, the barrier that Hitler swore no enemy would ever cross, was no longer a line on a map. It was an open wound in the Reich. Across the river, in the bombed ruins of Bonn, German officers stood in stunned silence as the first reports arrived. The Ludendorff Bridge still stood, and the Americans were pouring across it. In the chaos of retreat, demolition charges had failed, wires had snapped, and timing devices misfired. Hitler's fury was immediate and absolute. He summoned his commanders to the Reich Chancellery, his eyes burning, his voice shaking with rage. He shouted, "You will destroy that bridge. You will wipe out the Americans, or I will wipe you out." Orders went out like thunder. The Luftwaffe, though crippled and nearly fuelless, was thrown into the air again. Jet-powered Me-262s screamed toward the bridge, the last desperate pride of German engineering. Artillery batteries were repositioned along the hills to rain shells down on the crossing. Even frogmen from a half-trained sabotage unit were sent to swim through the freezing Rhine with explosives strapped for their chests. But the Americans were ready. On the western bank, engineers worked like men possessed. Every hour, more reinforcements arrived: bulldozers, pontoon boats, cranes, and anti-aircraft guns. Under the bridge's steel arches, they patched holes with scavenged timbers and scrap iron. Combat engineers tied ropes around their waists and climbed over the edge to cut away unexploded charges. They worked in total silence except for the hiss of torches and the distant rumble of German guns. When shells landed close, they flattened against the girders, waited for the echoes to fade, then got back to work. Overhead, American fighters patrolled constantly, weaving through smoke and flak to keep the Luftwaffe at bay. Each attack run from the Germans grew weaker, each bomb more desperate. One pilot radioed back after missing his target, "They've got the whole sky covered in lead down there." By the third day, the Germans were throwing anything they had: artillery, rockets, even crude V-2 rockets that fell miles off target. Still, the bridge held. Inside Hitler's bunker, the failure gnawed at his sanity. He blamed his generals, then his engineers, then fate itself. He ordered court-martials for the officers of the sector, demanding executions for cowardice and negligence. Some of those men who had fought since Poland were shot within days. But killing his own officers could not undo what had happened at Remagen. The psychological blow was devastating. For years, Nazi propaganda had promised that the Rhine was impenetrable. Now every German soldier knew it was a lie. While Berlin panicked, the Americans acted. Eisenhower saw the capture as more than a tactical fluke. It was an open gate into victory. Armored columns began streaming across. In less than a week, more than 25,000 men and thousands of vehicles had crossed the Rhine. Pontoon bridges sprouted on either side to ease the load. The Rhine, once Germany's proudest defense, became a highway for the Allied invasion. Reporters embedded with the First Army described the scene as organized chaos. Trucks roared through smoke, tanks rumbled across the trembling bridge deck, medics carried the wounded through crowds of cheering infantry. Soldiers scrawled their names on the girders: Ohio, Texas, Brooklyn, 1945. To them, the crossing wasn't just a maneuver, it was proof that the end was finally in sight. Yet even as victory loomed, the cost was relentless. Every crossing meant exposure to enemy fire. Artillery shells exploded on the banks, sending shards through the air like razors. Anti-aircraft crews fired until their gun barrels glowed red. At night, the bridge glimmered with welding sparks and tracer rounds, the river below flashing with the reflection of war. One engineer later said, "It was like working on the skeleton of a dying beast and knowing it had to live just one more day." In the same nights, German civilians along the Rhine huddled in basements, listening to the thunder of American tanks crossing their sacred river. Many began to realize that the war was lost. Some even crept out at dawn with white cloths tied to sticks, waving them toward the advancing columns. The Reich, that once bragged of endless conquest, was collapsing town by town, bridge by bridge. By March 10th, the bridge was under constant aerial attack. Dozens of German planes swooped in, dropping bombs and rockets, but American gunners turned the sky into a wall of fire. Smoke blanketed the town of Remagen. Rubble covered every street. Despite the devastation, the bridge endured. It became a symbol, a living monument of American stubbornness. The soldiers who guarded it began calling themselves the Remagen Regulars. To them, every sunrise meant another small miracle. Strategically, Remagen changed everything. With a firm foothold east of the Rhine, Allied planners no longer needed a massive, costly assault across the river. They now had momentum. Within weeks, the Third Army and the British to the north began their own crossings. The German Western Front fractured like glass. Entire divisions surrendered rather than fight a war already lost. What began as a spontaneous act of courage by a few men on March 7th had become the turning point of the final campaign in Europe. Yet nature and gravity were unforgiving. The Ludendorff Bridge had endured far more punishment than any structure could. Cracked beams groaned under the endless weight of tanks and trucks. American engineers warned it might not last. On March 17th, 10 days after its capture, they were right. Without warning, a deep metallic scream echoed across the river. Then a thunderous collapse. The center span plunged into the Rhine, taking 28 engineers with it. The water erupted in white foam and twisted steel. Those who survived stood silently on the banks, watching the current swallow the bridge that had changed the war. Yet even as it sank, no one saw defeat in the wreckage. The Americans had already built new pontoon bridges. The foothold was secure. The bridge had lived long enough to finish its mission. In a way, it died like the men who had taken it, in the line of duty, with purpose fulfilled. When the reports reached Eisenhower, he ordered a simple message sent to the units at Remagen. Well done. To the soldiers, those two words meant everything. They had done more than take a bridge. They had cracked the myth of Nazi invincibility. They had shown the world that determination and grit could topple empires. In Berlin, silence replaced fury. The Luftwaffe was broken, the armies shattered, and the Rhine, once a symbol of German might, now belonged to the Allies. Hitler's war was bleeding out. For every American who crossed at Remagen, there was the unspoken knowledge that they were walking through the doorway to the end. The sky over the Rhine cleared, the thunder faded, and on its quiet banks stood the ruins of the bridge that wasn't supposed to fall, yet refused to be forgotten. And somewhere in that silence, in the rippling current of the river, lingered the echo of a promise kept, that no wall, no river, no empire could stand against the courage of men who simply would not stop moving forward.
The Rhine had fallen silent. The bridge that once trembled under tanks and artillery now lay broken in the river, its steel bones glinting in the spring sunlight. But the silence was deceptive. On the eastern bank, the rumble of engines never stopped. Across makeshift pontoon bridges, convoys stretched for miles, tanks, trucks, and men flooding into the heart of Germany. The crossing at Remagen had opened the door, and now the flood had begun. For the men who had taken the bridge, there was no time to celebrate. Orders came quick and without rest. Advance, keep pressure on the enemy, no pause. They moved through the shattered countryside, through villages burned by retreating Germans, through forests echoing with the sound of dying artillery. The closer they pushed toward the interior, the clearer it became. The German army was breaking apart. Some units fought bitterly to the end. Others simply melted away. American soldiers who had once fought for every inch of ground now found themselves capturing entire towns before noon. Resistance came in sudden flashes: a sniper in a church steeple, a machine gun nest hidden among ruins. But behind those flashes, there was no plan, no strategy left. The German front had collapsed under its own weight. The once proud Wehrmacht, stretched and starving, could no longer hold back the tide. From the air, it was even clearer. American bombers flew unopposed over highways littered with wreckage, trucks, horses, tanks abandoned by their crews. Pilots looked down and saw the end of a war, written in smoke and silence. One of them, a veteran from the early raids over France, said softly into his mic, "They're done. They just don't know it yet." In the command centers, the reports poured in faster than they could be read. Towns that had resisted for months were surrendering in hours. Columns of German soldiers marched toward American lines with their hands raised, some barefoot, some no older than 16. The Third Reich, once built on discipline and fear, was disintegrating into chaos. Yet for every victory, there was a reminder of the cost. The men who had crossed at Remagen carried the scars of the crossing, the faces of those who never made it back. They had seen friends vanish in the river, crushed under steel or caught in the endless barrage that tried to destroy what they had built. At night, when the engines cooled and the gunfire faded, some would sit quietly beside their tanks, staring at the horizon. The war was nearly over, but the memories would never end. Still, duty left no room for reflection. The First Army pressed eastward, cutting deeper into Germany. Every mile revealed new horrors:
camps filled with starved prisoners, towns turned to ash, rivers running black with oil and smoke. For many young soldiers, these were their first glimpses of what they had truly been fighting against. One lieutenant wrote home, "We thought we came here to win a war. Now I see we came here to end something evil." Behind them, the engineers who had held the Remagen Bridge were being rotated out, exhausted, hollow-eyed, but proud. Many of them had been under constant fire for 10 straight days. When they finally left the riverbank, they carried little more than their helmets and a single thought: we made it last. Meanwhile, far behind enemy lines, the German command was unraveling. Hitler's rage had turned into paranoia. He ordered impossible counterattacks from divisions that no longer existed, shouted at maps showing armies that were already gone. His generals knew the truth. The Allies were closing in from all sides. The Soviet Red Army was pushing from the east. From the west, the Americans and British were unstoppable. Germany was being squeezed like a collapsing fortress. In April, as the Allies advanced beyond the Rhine, resistance crumbled completely. American units liberated cities that had been under Nazi rule for years: Cologne, Kassel, and eventually Leipzig. Each capture was greeted with both triumph and disbelief. Civilians came out waving white sheets, offering what little food they had left. The conquerors were no longer seen as invaders, but as the end of terror itself. Still, the soldiers felt a strange emptiness. After years of fighting, there was no single moment of victory, only a slow realization that the enemy was gone. "We were too tired to cheer," one veteran recalled. "We just kept moving forward because that's what we were trained to do." Among those men was Lieutenant Timmerman, the same young officer who had first spotted the Ludendorff Bridge still standing. Now, weeks later, he stood in the ruins of a German town, looking out at the horizon once seemed unreachable. Around him, his men were laughing for the first time in months, tossing helmets, cleaning rifles, talking about home. But Timmerman's face stayed quiet. "We made it," someone said to him. He nodded once. "Yeah, but not all of us." The cost of the crossing had been steep, and for the Americans, every victory carried the shadow of those who had not survived to see it. They had broken through the final barrier, crossed the river that once divided empires, and changed the course of the war, but it had come at the price of youth, innocence, and peace of mind. As April wore on, the Allied advance accelerated. American and Soviet troops closed in from opposite directions, racing toward the Elbe River. In the final days, the once mighty Luftwaffe barely existed. A handful of desperate pilots flying outdated planes trying to slow the inevitable. American P-51s and Thunderbolts hunted them down over burning fields. The sky that had once been filled with fire was now clear and blue. By the time word reached the front that Hitler was dead, most soldiers didn't even cheer. The war had already ended for them in their minds, somewhere on that cold, smoky bridge over the Rhine, where they had defied death and kept moving forward. For historians, the crossing at Remagen was a tactical miracle. For the men who lived it, it was something far more personal. Proof that courage can bend the course of history. It showed that leadership isn't always about orders. Sometimes it's about instinct, the moment when a young officer decides to move instead of wait, to act instead of question. Months later, when peace finally settled over Europe, a few of the veterans returned to the river. The remains of the Ludendorff Bridge still jutted from the water like broken ribs. Birds nested in its rusting towers. The current flowed quietly beneath, carrying no trace of the war it had once witnessed. One old sergeant, stood there for a long time, staring across the water. "We didn't know what we were doing," he said softly. "We just knew it had to be done." For the Americans, Remagen became more than a battle. It became a symbol of what made their army different. Not just power, but persistence. Not just fire, but faith. The kind of belief that turns exhaustion into action, fear into resolve, and a single bridge into the path to victory. The Germans had believed the Rhine was their final wall, the river that would stop the invaders. But when the smoke cleared, it wasn't a wall at all. It was a reflection, showing the difference between those who fight for power and those who fight for freedom. And in that reflection, across the quiet waters of Remagen, the world saw the truth, that courage once unleashed cannot be stopped by rivers, by fear, or by the ruins of a dying empire. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the guns across Europe went silent. But for the men who had crossed the Rhine at Remagen, silence was not peace, it was memory. The sound of the river, the thunder of collapsing steel, the cries of comrades, these echoes followed them home. In the days after Germany's surrender, the Ludendorff Bridge was gone, swallowed by the Rhine. But its ghost lingered in every headline, every soldier's story. It had become a symbol, not of destruction, but of determination. Back in the United States, newsreels played the footage over and over again. American soldiers sprinting across a bridge they were never supposed to reach, tanks rumbling forward as artillery lit up the horizon. Audiences cheered in theaters, but for the veterans sitting quietly among them, it wasn't about cheering. It was about remembering. Some of those men never returned to the battlefield. They couldn't. Their war had stayed behind their eyes. Others tried to rebuild life piece by piece, a family, a job, a sense of normal. Yet each time they saw a bridge, they remembered that one bridge, the one they were told couldn't be taken, the one that changed everything. For the U.S. Army, Remagen became a case study in leadership under fire. Military academies still teach it today, how quick decisions, courage, and initiative can turn chaos into victory. But beyond the textbooks, Remagen became something more deeply American. It represented the power of ordinary men doing extraordinary things when it mattered most. Lieutenant Timmerman, the man who led the first troops onto the bridge, was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. But he never saw himself as a hero. In an interview years later, he said quietly, "We were just doing our job. The real heroes were the ones who didn't come home." He lived a quiet life after the war, working, raising a family, rarely talking about what happened. Like many veterans, he carried the memory privately, as something too big, too heavy for words. Across the country, families of the fallen received telegrams, short, cold lines of type that carried a lifetime of loss. "We regret to inform you." For them, the bridge was both pride and pain. It had brought victory, but at the cost of sons and brothers they would never see again. In Remagen itself, the scars of the battle remained for decades. The twisted remains of the bridge towers were left standing as a memorial, blackened stone rising over the calm river. Visitors came from around the world, soldiers, historians, tourists, all drawn by the same question: how did they do it? The answer, as every American veteran knew, wasn't in the tactics or the weapons. It was in the will. The belief that if something had to be done, it could be done. That belief carried America not just across the Rhine, but through the rest of the 20th century, through new wars, new challenges, new uncertainties. Remagen became part of the American spirit, that stubborn refusal to stop moving forward, even when everything says turn back. As years passed, the veterans grew older. Their reunions became smaller.
The men who had crossed the bridge began crossing other kinds of bridges, from life into memory. Yet every March, on the anniversary of the battle, a few would still gather. They would stand on the riverbank, looking across the calm waters where chaos once raged, and they would say little. They didn't need to. The silence said enough. One of them was an old sergeant who had lost half his platoon on the crossing. Was asked by a young journalist, "Do you think it was worth it?" He paused for a long moment, then nodded. He said, "We did what had to be done. That's all history ever really asks of a man." In the decades that followed, the story of Remagen appeared in books, documentaries, even Hollywood films. But no film could ever truly capture the fear, the smoke, the trembling in a soldier's hands as he ran across a bridge he was told would explode beneath him. Because Remagen wasn't just about victory, it was about belief. The belief that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. Today, if you stand by the Rhine and look at where the bridge once stood, you can still see the stone towers, silent and unmoving. Inside one of them, the Germans built a peace museum filled with photos, letters, and artifacts from both sides of the battle. American helmets sit beside German ones. Letters home from both armies are displayed under the same glass. It's no longer a place of division. It's a place of memory. Children now walk through those halls, reading the names of soldiers who once stood there in smoke and thunder. They see pictures of Timmerman and his men crossing a bridge that was never meant to be crossed, and they ask their parents, why did they do it? The answer always comes the same: because someone had to. And that's what Remagen became, not a story about war, but about the people who refuse to give up when the world needs them most. In every generation, America finds new bridges to cross, new challenges, new battles that test its courage. And every time, somewhere, deep inside the nation's heart, the spirit of Remagen lives on, that same voice that says, keep moving, keep pushing, don't stop now. The bridge may have fallen, but its meaning never did. It still stands, not in steel, but in the stories of those who carried its memory across time. It stands in every soldier who refuses to back down. It stands in every worker who builds when others doubt. It stands in every American who believes that impossible is just another word for unfinished. Remagen was more than a bridge. It was proof that when courage meets opportunity, history bends. And as the Rhine flows quietly under the German sky, it carries with it the reflection of those who once stood above it, young, scared, brave, and crossed not just a river, but a line between fear and freedom.